And we're back. It's NorthstarNews.com. I'm Walter Fields, executive editor.
And I'm Rob Tarver, general counsel for North Star News.
You know, we have been watching what's been going on with the Select House Committee on the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. And through the hearings that have been held thus far, it seems as though this committee is building a sufficient case for the United States Attorney General Merrick Garland to bring charges against former President Donald Trump and many of his advisors. And so, Rob, I think for the public's edification, if you could just lay out from a legal perspective what you have heard that would lead you to say that a case can be made, a criminal case can be made against the former president.
Yeah, you summarize it in a nutshell. They've done a really, really good job of laying out the case. And first, we have to understand what the case actually would result in. We're talking about basically conspiracy to commit a crime. Conspiracy is just an agreement between one or more individuals to do something illegal. Here, it would be obstructing the administration of law or trying to obstruct the congressional movement towards certifying the election. The other thing is just individuals can be charged with the same thing, which is the obstructing. The case against Trump is really pretty simple if he were an ordinary citizen. And here's what it is. Number one, what the committee has showed is that Trump knew there was no fraud in the election. And administration members told him over and over again. And many people want to act like, he perhaps didn't believe it or whatever. But remember, the standard here is he's an adult. So he's entitled to the same understanding that other adults have. If people who are experts are telling you over and over again that this is not the case, we're entitled to believe that he knew there was no fraud. Second, that he knowingly pushed forward with those lies, knowing that it was stolen. This is really important because if you move forward with the lies knowing it's stolen, you're acting in bad faith. And the third is that he directed this mob to storm the Capitol. And he directed them to storm the Capitol knowing what? He knew that Pence was there. He basically targeted Pence through his conversation where he said he didn't care whether or not they got Mike Pence. They're not there for me, remember? They're there for Mike Pence. So he directed this mob to storm the Capitol. But what kind of mob was it? It was a mob that was armed. Remember the magnometers. He said, remove those magnometers. I want more people in. He knew at the time that there are weapons. Why else would you try to remove the very thing that detects weapons in order to be able to allow more people who had weapons? So we got a mob who's going to storm the Capitol. He tells them to storm the Capitol, knowing that they're armed, and the mob does storm the Capitol and they do damage. And what's the linchpin in this whole thing? The final nail in his coffin is that he refused to tell those people to leave even after the violence broke out. He sat there and watched it. Remember, he's the one with the power. He called them there. He should have had the power to call them off. Only hours later does he tell them to go home. And this, Walter, is the case that was laid out by the congressional committee. And it was laid out directly. It was laid out clearly. And realistically, if this were anyone else, man, if this were anyone else, this would be a slam dunk case.
And I think it's also important for the public. This committee has been meeting for over a year. And I think there was some question in the public about what they were doing. But we now see what they were doing. They have interviewed and deposed thousands of people, in White House insiders, advisors, folks who were in the periphery. And we're beginning to see what some of that testimony was during these hearings. And I think this committee has brilliantly sort of created the breadcrumbs to lead to a criminal charge against the president. During these hearings, when they've shown snippets of depositions that were taken, it's amazing when you hear the audio clips and you piece together everything that folks are saying. Now, these are all Trump insiders.
Right.
These aren't Democrats who have an axe to grind with Donald Trump. These are people who were in the Trump administration where you have the former Attorney General, Bob Barr, who said, I told the president that these claims of election fraud were bullshit.
Yeah,
You had people like Ben Ginsburg, the foremost Republican attorney who specializes in election law, who was saying, like, there was no fraud here. Like, I've looked at these issues for decades. There was none there. Well, you have other people who have said, look, these were the most secure elections we have ever had. Yes, there were instances of violations of election law, but nothing that would even come close to systemic election fraud that could have an impact on this election. So I think this committee, and I think we spoke privately um, about the CNN special on Watergate, where they went back and we looked at the Watergate committee and its work. And the thing that people forget, the Watergate committee had been meeting for some time before the 1972 presidential election. Richard Nixon won that election in a landslide against George McGovern, one of the largest margins in presidential election history. The Watergate story was already out. The public was sort of not paying attention, but then the committee hit full stride and all hell broke loose. So I think we're seeing the same pattern here, because we're now beginning to see polls that show that over half of Republicans polled don't want Donald Trump to run again.
yeah,
So they're beginning to get the message that this guy, as much as they may like him, he's now become poison to a large part of the Republican Party. And I think as we go forward with these hearings, because we don't know what other cards this committee is holding. I
yeah.
mean, they've been brilliant. You know,
You
they've
bring up
almost
an
treated.
interesting point when you use the word brilliant. There have been nothing short of brilliant. And here's what's really interesting. You talk about Watergate 50 years ago, more than that, actually. I guess, yeah, about 50 years ago. Um, the standard that the committee used was standard committee action, working within the framework of the establishment. Here we are in 2022, recognizing that human beings perceive information differently. This committee made a decision and a determination that they were going to make this a production that was much easier for this generation to understand. And it was well produced. And people are on them about the theatrics and everything, but this wasn't theatrics. This was just production. And it was masterful. It was masterful on two levels. It was masterful on a legal level because they took their time and brought out each and every fact slowly. It was masterful on a production level. So, I mean, your point about Watergate is really interesting, because here we are, fast forward in terms of the production. It's completely different. But I got to tell you, this makes Watergate look like a day at Disneyland or something.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this has been a master class in strategic communication. If you remember, if you're old enough to remember the Watergate hearings, where sort of every member of that committee got a shot during those hearings to either ask questions or to make statements, they have carefully managed, Benny Thompson has carefully managed this committee so that there would be certain members who would be assigned for each hearing to basically ask the question of the witnesses, and then they would intersperse strategic video clips from depositions of either witnesses or staff of the committee who would sort of frame what we were hearing.
Yeah,
And I think you have hit it on the head in terms of this committee recognizes that communications is different in 2022 than it was in 1972. So they have created a production, so to speak,
mm-hmm.
that could penetrate the American audience and how we are accustomed to receiving information today. So what do we see after the hearing? We see snippets of that video testimony. It's been so carefully framed and packaged so that people can easily understand the case that this committee is building. And look, they've built in emotional high points, having Capitol police officers testify. They've brought in, common folk, the folk from Georgia, the mother and daughter who described what
Yeah,
they
right.
experienced as election workers. Like, they have really done a masterful job in making sure that the American public sees not only the crime, but the depth of the impact of that crime.
But there's a
Yeah.
danger in this. Isn't there a danger in this? And this is what I'm thinking about here. We're seeing these people and we're coming to see them coming out and giving all this information and these revelations, and we're like, wow, this is great, this is fantastic, but the question is, are we making them heroes for what they should have done over the past 4 years? Had they done this a long time ago, would there have been a difference? I'm not sure there would have, but I'm asking you that. What's your thought about that? Because look, if they had come out before, perhaps it would have just gone by the wayside. Some people did come out, but now I'm concerned that we're making Pat Cipollone, these other people into heroes because all they're doing is doing what they should have done all along.
Well, there are two ways to look at it. So, and there are two layers of witnesses. There are the insiders who certainly had the opportunity to speak up beforehand. Then there are the common folk, the election workers and the Capitol Hill police officers. Now, for the insiders, yes, absolutely, there's a danger in making them martyrs or heroes for what they're saying right now. But we also have to put this in the perspective of everyday life, because every day in the workplace, there are instances where employees see wrongdoing and they remain quiet
Mm,
because they don't want to disturb the status quo and they don't want to jeopardize their careers. So in many ways, you have to look at some of these people. Inside the Beltway is a small community. Now, there are certain people like Bob Barr that he was not going to be harmed. His career is set. He's made his money. He could have certainly spoke up or resigned as attorney general in the moment and said, I can't be a party to this. There are other folks lower down the food chain. You look at someone like a Cassidy Hutchinson, a young lady who's in her like mid to late 20s, who
yeah,
has a lot of years left in Washington, D.C. What would have happened if Cassidy Hutchinson had resigned in a very public way and made these charges? We don't know. Would she have been silenced? Would she have been attacked? Or would she have been protected? So I think it's hard in hindsight to kind of look at this. What I think is amazing is that there were clearly a number of Trump insiders who saw that this president was unhinged and were alarmed that he was bringing in a group of people like Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani and creating this sort of secondary cabinet, so to speak.
yeah,
I mean, this description of this meeting, this confrontation in the, you know, wee hours of the morning in the Oval Office, sounds like something out of a movie. That you had White House staffers confronting this rogue group who were trying to give all these insane ideas to Donald Trump about
right.
how to flip this election, seize voting machines. And you have the White House insiders looking at them like, are you crazy? We can't go out there and seize voting machines. And so, I think this one thing this demonstrates, we hold the presidency in such high regard because for the common person, we can't even imagine what that type of power looks like or how that type of power operates. This really has opened to public view the dangers of what can happen with an unhinged presidency. We've always believed that the Constitution protects us.
Yeah,
Clearly, it
clearly.
doesn't.
Yeah, it clearly doesn't. And the fact of the matter is that as you look at all of these individuals, and you look at what they did over the years, you talked about Bob Barr. Remember, Bob Barr is now singing a different tune. And even now, after all this, after talking about and using the word bullshit and things like that, and recognizing what's happened here, he still says he would vote for him again. Now, what does that tell you about the state of politics and morals and ethics in America. It tells you that we have a complete deterioration. If you can recognize that someone has acted in an unethical and an immoral fashion and still say that you're going to vote for that person again to run the country, to set the standard for the country. And this is a huge problem. What this hearing has done is that it has exposed America for all of its immorality, all of its unethical behavior, and really just pointed out how corrupt things can get at the top. But let's talk for a minute, Walter, about the Justice Department, because now they've laid this thing out. And I told you what the case was early on. And I can tell you this, as an attorney who's practiced in federal court, I have had individuals prosecuted and convicted on less evidence than this. So what do you think about the Justice Department? I have my own thoughts, but I want to find out what your thoughts are.
Well, you know, I have a column on NorthstarNews.com titled "Trump Must Be Indicted," and I call Attorney General Merrick Garland to task because I think the failure to do so jeopardizes this nation. I think if Merrick Garland does not bring a charge against Donald Trump, he opens the door for the complete destruction of American democracy. Because at some point, the old adage that no one is above the law has to be held truthful. And for an attorney general of the United States to ignore the evidence that has been laid out sets a very dangerous precedent. You are now complicit in giving individuals who occupy the Oval Office complete power and authority to do whatever they want to do. If Merrick Garland fails in this moment, I think the American public should be calling for his resignation or his firing, because we have to remember the Attorney General. Look, the White House counsel is pretty much the president's attorney, right? The Attorney General of the United States is the people's attorney. That person is supposed to represent the interest of the American public and defend the rule of law. If Merrick Garland fails, he should be fired.
Yeah.
And I really mean that, because I don't know what other evidence you need to bring a charge against Donald Trump and his cronies, and quite frankly, some members of the House of Representatives.
And here's
Because
what's really interesting. Come to these guys, they say, what evidence do you need? Well, we don't have any statements from him. We don't have a direct tie. But the fact of the matter is, I can't tell you. The cases are so few and far between where you get someone that up and says, well, I'm ready to commit this crime. I'm going to do this act. I'm going to do whatever. They do it by inference. And if you can draw the inference from that behavior, then that's how you get to the conviction. I've been harder on Merrick Garland than anybody else, but I do know this. I know that the Department of Justice has a policy that says that you cannot bring these cases unless you believe that you are going to be successful. The one thing I think this hearing has done, Walter, is I think that it has changed the whole dynamic to the point where most Americans who have watched this believe that the prosecution could be successful. And if we look into history, so many times prosecutions are driven not top down, but bottom up. There's the groundswell that comes up to move the prosecution forward. And here's a really interesting case. R. Kelly. Remember, R. Kelly ran around for years and years. And it was not until that documentary came out that showed the young ladies and what they were accusing him of, and got into his actions, that a real prosecution occurred. That's not abnormal. That's normally the way that a lot of these higher profile prosecutions happen. So I agree with you 100%. I mean, I think he has to do this for the good of the country. And if he doesn't do it, that's a huge problem.
and you talk about direct inference. So this is the president who invited people to come to Washington, D.C. because it was going to be wild. And now they have the evidence of his edited speech that he gave on the grounds, right, of the mall, and it was changed. So the original speech had language in there which was directing people to go to the Capitol. He changed that language so that no one else could see what his real motive was. But
Hmm.
on the day of the speech, he reinserted that language and said, we're going to go down to the Capitol. And what did the witness say who was at the Capitol that day? The gentleman who said he lost his job, right? He lost his house. He said, I was there because Donald Trump told us to be there, right?
Yeah.
So it's clear they've connected the words used by Donald Trump and the actions that resulted. The fact that he said, oh, don't worry about the folks with weapons. You don't have to screen those folks because they're not angry with me. They're not here to get me. They're here to get those folks down in the Capitol, right? And the vice president.
He served up the vice president.
He served up the vice president. This is what's crazy about this. You have a United States president who basically told his folks, if the vice president doesn't do what I want him to do, he's yours,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? So you had the United States vice president who had to hide in the bowels of the United States Capitol because it was a violent mob that was intent on harming him. Like, this is so far beyond Watergate. You know, we're the same age. You remember what it was like when Watergate and all the commentary, like, this is the
Yeah.
worst thing
This is the
that's
worst thing that could possibly
that
happen in
could
the American
possibly happen.
presidency. Yeah. It
And
was
this
horrible.
is Watergate was nothing compared to this. This truly is an example of what can happen in this country that could lead to the overthrow of the government. We had a president who had command of the military, right? Didn't call anybody during the insurrection, didn't call the Capitol Hill police, right? Didn't call the Secret Service, didn't call the FBI, didn't call the military. He
Despite the
was
fact that he wanted to call the military for the Black Lives Matter protest.
exactly.
We know what his inclinations were. We know what his first thought is. Call those people in if there's a problem.
Donald Trump sat in the Oval Office and watched this thing unfold as entertainment because in his mind, this was the way that he regained and retained power. Now, let's flip the script for a minute. Could you imagine if Barack Obama had lost his reelection campaign and had did this? Like, what the reaction would
Call black people to Washington D.C.
exactly call black people to Washington D.C. to defend his president because the presidency because the election was stolen from him. And look, I think one of the most brilliant things that has been brought out by this committee was the fact when they said, well, you know what? Al Gore accepted that he lost.
Mhm.
And that was an election that it was questionable, really questionable about whether or not Al Gore really lost. But what did Al Gore do? Al Gore stood up and said, we have a process. I'm going to respect that process. And I'm going to acknowledge the fact that I did not win this election. Richard Nixon did the same thing in 1960, lost in a whisker hair election to John Kennedy.
Right.
Could have contested that and acknowledge that John Kennedy was the next president. And then 8 years later, Hubert Humphrey in a close loss to Richard Nixon. That I watched that as a kid. It was a wee hours of the morning before they declared Nixon had won. Hubert Humphrey said, we have a new president. It's Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
It's only Donald Trump who, through his own twisted mind, who never ever believed in the idea of the American presidency. He believed in the British idea of a monarchy. He decided that I am going to rule no matter what. And that all these people that work in the White House, they don't work for you, the American public, they work for me,
Right.
including the Attorney General, including the US military. And I will determine how this country is governed, me singularly. And he had a bunch of complicit Republicans on Capitol Hill who allowed this danger to be unleashed upon the American public. And
And who
those
were,
folks have to be held accountable.
yeah, and who were willing to make him basically a dictator. That's what's so crazy. So
And a deity.
yeah, yeah. So if you look, you talked about Barack Obama and what would have happened with us. Um, it was interesting because of the notable absence of those Black Republicans who were Trump supporters on the Hill. And if we were doing a segment, I called it the BBB segment, the Blacks Behaving Badly segment. And lo and behold, when I thought that all of the Black Trumpites had regained their consciousness and got their minds together, we find that behind so much of this is Katrina Pearson.
Yes.
And all of a sudden we see that behind the scenes, that young lady, Black woman, is advising the president as to when to put out tweets, how to put out tweets, and his strategy. So it's again, it is a stain on Black America as far as I'm concerned. How is it that we're now ensconced in history as part of the largest coup movement to ever take part in this country?
Because some people are seduced by the proximity to white power.
Yeah.
You had a bunch of Black Republicans and their little minions. Don't forget the two, what were the name? Diamond and
Silk.
Diamond and Silk, right? Two of the most ignorant Black people you could even put in front of a camera,
yeah,
that they used as messengers for Donald Trump.
They
and
could have been
this,
called Amos and Andy, realistically.
oh, absolutely. And so you look at this and you really have to shake your head, because when you think about the danger that this president posed to Black people, when you think about the danger he posed to America, when you look at his appointments to the court, when you look at the damage that the current United States Supreme Court is doing and the potential damage around the corner, you just have to ask yourself, like, where are we as a nation and where are we as a people that you could have people who would be willingly submissive and complicit in what this man was attempting to do? And I honestly hope that many of those people will end up in jail. It will be the most satisfying moment to see some of these people led out of a courtroom in handcuffs, because that's the only way you can teach people lessons. And look, to the Justice Department's credit, over 800 people have been charged from that riot at the Capitol, and hundreds of people are seeing jail time.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people say, oh, they should be in jail for 10 years. No, they should be in jail sufficient with the crime. Many of them were just guilty of breaking into the United States Capitol. If you give someone 6 months to a year on that, I'm good, because prison is no joke. Like, many of these people felt that I can do this and they will never arrest me. I will never go to jail. Well, guess what? Some of those people are sitting behind bars this morning.
Yeah.
Who are facing the reality that they are now have a federal conviction. They are criminally convicted of a crime that will be on their record.
I agree with you. The consequences, those consequences are severe because they will wear them for the rest of their life. My only quarrel with the whole thing is I have clients who've done so much less. They've had so much more of a consequence than this, even though they're going to continue their record going forward. Now, I do understand also that both the Justice Department, the federal justice system, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons is overwhelmed. You don't get a mass event like this, and no one's prepared for that.
Exactly.
You can't prepare for those kind of prosecutions. You think of the prosecutors who have to review each of those cases, all that video, and all of that just to be able to move it forward. It's difficult. And it's hard. So they did the best they could do under these circumstances, which I think is sufficient. But you talk about the country and moving forward. There's another bit of news that came out that scares the devil out of me. And that is that the Secret Service apparently erased texts that dealt with all of the information between the Secret Service and Donald Trump, and Secret Service agents between themselves dealing with Donald Trump, from January 6th and January 5th, knowing, and they did this knowing that the committee was seeking that information, that the Congress was seeking that information. That is one of the scariest things in my mind that there is, because those are the mechanisms and systems of justice that we depend on to be able to make sure that we can function as a country. And if they're going to be complicit with the president and complicit with corruption, then I think they need to be held criminally accountable. We've been too soft on all of these institutions lately. And if you really, as you said before, if you really want to stop this, the only thing that these people respect is deterrence. You know, one of the things they've been preaching all these years about the death penalty and higher sentencing is that, oh, it's going to deter people from crime. That's why we do it. Well, you know what? If it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. You guys need to be deterred because you're not trying to steal drugs or steal products or steal TVs. You're trying to steal America. And how
Yes.
much more of a penalty should there be for that?
I'll tell you this, the thing that I find really frightening about this revelation about the Secret Service, you have to remember that these are supposed to be the elite law enforcement officers who protect not just the president as an individual, but the idea of the office of the United States president. And we have to remember the history of the Secret Service. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, that was a very low period for the United States Secret Service, because many people blame the Secret Service for allowing President Kennedy to ride in a vehicle without any protection, right? We had an American president who was assassinated in full public view. After that moment, the U.S. Secret Service had to do a lot of work to regain the trust of the American public. And there were assassination attempts after that. Gerald Ford had a couple. Ronald Reagan, we remember, but they survived, right? So now you see the United States Secret Service, which we have always felt was sort of beyond reproach in terms of their duty and honor to their calling to protect the institution of the presidency. Now they're looking like they are nothing more than patsies of an individual who's occupying the Oval Office. The fact that, look, you can erase text, but what about the security standards that you're going to back up everything so that there will be a record? You are the protective service of the president. And so I'm really alarmed by this.
Yeah.
And the fact that there has now been a description of an incident in the presidential motorcade where you had the individual who is the president who forcefully tries to sway a Secret Service agent to obey orders that they know go against the best measures of protecting the president. The Secret Service has a black eye right now.
Yeah.
Because how do you present yourself as this crack security unit and you can't even control someone who's in a vehicle that you're telling him for your own good, for the sake of the nation, we can't take you to the Capitol. Our job is to protect you as president. So we're going back to the most secure place that there is right now. That's the White House.
Well, they would argue that they did do what they were supposed to do. But the fact of the matter is, you know, whatever you did, we don't know the full story because you've chosen to remove all of the actual physical evidence away. And we should have known that something was up with the Secret Service, because in 2019, Trump took one of his Secret Service detail and made that person a deputy chief of staff, which quite frankly should be improper, because how do you take a person from that type of position, put them into a political position, which means there had to be some sort of political leanings all along, which should not be happening from an agency that's there to protect you as the president. And don't forget, 1865, Secret Service is formed. 1867, they changed their mission from just protecting the president to protecting against fraud on the United States government. That's part of their mission too. It's beyond the president. They are supposed to protect against fraud against the United States government, and they haven't done that. And
Well,
so,
that's why they fall under the United States Treasury Department,
yes, yeah,
right? And the thing that disturbs me about the motorcade story is that that probably was not the first time. Like, how many times did they allow this president to do things that they knew were wrong? And I only think this time they were insistent on disobeying him because they understood what was going on at the Capitol. And
yeah,
I think they said, this is a moment where all hell is breaking loose. We will look like a bunch of idiots if we drive the president of the United States into that chaos of that mob. But I thought, when I heard the story being told, I said, okay, so how many times did Trump bully the Secret Service?
yeah.
Because that's what he does.
He's a bully.
He,
He,
he's a
he is a
bully.
bully. And you know what? Look, the whole, if you were to sum up everything that we have seen over the last, whatever, the term of his presidency, and over this last hearing, these hearing days, it would simply be president gone wild. Donald Trump was wilding out. That's all he was doing. And he was doing everything that he could do against the norms of our society. And no one was in a position to stop him. And think about those people. And this is why this is so unique. I do place blame on a lot of different people. But I also understand that when you're acting with something that is so bizarre, so outside of the norms of behavior, in many ways, there's no real way to deal with it. And when you finally get to the point where you recognize that it's gone too far, you're probably powerless to deal with it. And I'm sure that that's how a lot of people in that White House felt, that they didn't have the ability at that point to even deal with it, because you have too many people now that have been corrupted on that side to be able to stand up with you on the opposite side. And that's what I
Look,
think really happened here.
and here's the thing. He knew better.
Yeah.
Because if we go back to that election, about 8 months before that November election, he was saying things like, they're going to steal this election from me. He was setting it up way ahead of time so that he could come back after the election and claim that the election was stolen. This was intentional on his part. He knew, and look, when you run for president, you know, they get daily tracking polls which show where you are. They knew going into election day that he had lost that election.
Yeah.
It was clear.
Mhm.
So in his mind, in the months leading up to the election, he's seeing how the poll is going. He's like, oh, I got to figure out a way to spin a story that makes it look like this election was rigged. And he didn't care whether he had to attack a Democrat or a Republican. He didn't care about them Georgia Republicans who were just doing their job. He was willing to put their lives at stake. This guy is sinister. He is evil. He knew, and you mentioned President's Gone Wild. You remember in the 1990s that stupid videotape series that had Girls Gone
Girls
Wild,
Gone Wild.
right? Right.
Exactly.
So
That's what I was talking about.
these were all young women who knew better. But the minute that they were away from home, they were just doing the most ratchet stuff,
Yep.
right? Donald Trump knew better.
Donald Trump's gone ratchet.
But he went
ratchet.
ratchet when he realized that he was not going to win re-election. And this is the conspiracy part of it. He plotted and planned this. He put people in close proximity to the White House who would aid and abet this strategy. Rudy Giuliani being one of them.
Yeah.
And remember, this is a former mayor, a former U.S. attorney who went down to Arizona for a bogus public hearing and spun all sorts of lies. Some of these lies are so crazy that any reasonable person who would hear them, that the Dominion voting machines were being controlled by thermostats. It's like
General Michael Flynn, who was
oh,
a revered intelligence officer in the United States Army. And his history, you know, quite frankly, his history is impressive. But you got this guy now talking about Nest thermostats controlling Dominion machines. And it just shows it shows in a number of ways how weak the American mind is and how susceptible we are and can be to these types of influences. And you no longer ask how different historical events happen. You no longer ask how people in Nazi Germany were seduced into the type of behavior and accepting lawless, criminal, heinous, unethical, immoral behavior. Because you see, these are the seeds of it right here. But you had asked me earlier on in the program about the legal case here. And I told you, I think it's an interesting legal case. What we have to remember is this, and I want everyone who's listening to always remember this. We have a maxim, a saying in law, that a person intends the natural and probable consequences of their actions. And so you have to ask yourself at every stage of Donald Trump's existence and behavior in this whole scenario, what did he believe, or what would a rational and reasonable person believe would be the normal consequence of what they're doing? What is the normal consequence of calling armed people to the Capitol when they believe that the election's been stolen? What do you think is going to happen? Do you think they're going to go there non-violently, or do you think they're going to go there violently if they have weapons?
Chaos was the strategy.
Mhm.
And so you mentioned Mike Flynn, who now I call Mike, I take the fifth Flynn, because in his depositions,
And
look,
I did see, I have to tell the viewers that you did post the Dave Chappelle, I
plead
take
the
the
fifth.
fifth skit.
Like the fifth. Look, it got so bad that Flynn wouldn't even say, I plead the fifth. He just turned to his attorney, said fifth, fifth. I mean, this is a retired military officer. I mean, it's amazing. And I want to end this conversation by referencing what I think is one of the most incredible things we have seen throughout this process. The fact that this past week, we had a group of the most prominent conservative lawyers and retired judges issue their own report. And the title of the report was Lost, Not Stolen, where they lay out the case point by point for every lawsuit that was brought claiming fraud. They refuted. For every claim of fraud, they refuted. And I think it's an amazing report that we have never seen before in American history, where you have a group of admittedly partisan lawyers who are telling people, and judges who are telling people, do not believe any of this. So we're going to close on this, and we'll see what happens after this committee.
Yeah, we'll see, all right. But I got to tell you, what should happen is that this should go to the Department of Justice. Department of Justice should take this and take their time, because it's not going to happen before the November election. But take your time and go through it. And I predict that we will see prosecutions.
Well, I do too. I absolutely do too. So until the next time, this is Walter Fields, executive editor of NorthstarNews.com, and we invite you to visit our site.
And I'm Rob Tarver.
We will see you next time as we talk around the table.